Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and welcome to 2026. Now, if all goes according to plan, 2026 should be the year that we finally see humans return to lunar orbit, with the launch of the upcoming Artemis II mission potentially in just a matter of weeks, and it will be using an SLS rocket, or the Space Launch System. And this feels like a good time to address a question I've been asked by a few people over the past year or so, which is, how could the moon landings be real if SLS is worse than the Saturn V? Now, to clarify the argument, Apollo missions landed 2 humans on the moon with a single Saturn V rocket. Currently, SLS by comparison is not landing humans on the moon because it's not launching with a lander. It's only able to get humans to lunar orbit, and the missions that will land on the moon are going to require a lander being flown separately to the moon. SLS is dubbed as being more powerful, with a maximum thrust of 39.1 million newtons versus 34.5 million newtons of the Saturn V. However, the Saturn V was rated to be able to get 43,500 kilograms of payload to the moon, whilst SLS can only get 27,000 kilograms. So, people are questioning, could the Saturn V really get that much payload to the moon when the current SLS can't, despite it being more powerful? And if it couldn't get that much payload to the moon, then surely that means that humans didn't actually land on the moon. Now, not only does SLS produce more thrust than the Saturn V, but it's also smaller and has less mass at launch, which you can see by comparing their launches, such as has been done here by Retrospace HD, who synced up Artemis I's launch with Apollo 17, and you can see how much quicker SLS clears the tower than the Saturn V. So, how could the Saturn V get more payload to the moon? Well, those thrust figures and the headline of SLS being more powerful than the Saturn V doesn't really tell the full story. The overall picture is far more complex. Those headline figures of maximum thrust are how much power they produce at launch. However, that thrust amount is not consistent all the way to Earth orbit. Both are multi-stage rockets. The idea of staging is that rather than a giant single-stage rocket, which would then need to carry all of the dead weight of empty parts of the rocket to orbit, you instead discard sections during the ascent to reduce the amount of mass that the engines are trying to lift. And it also then allows you to switch to more efficient engines once you're in space. But the different stages of SLS and the Saturn V each produce different amounts of thrust and each burn for different durations of time. And this is where things get quite complicated. You have to consider also how much mass is it moving, how is that mass changing as the fuel burns, how long are the engines producing that much thrust for, and much more. You can't just look at the maximum thrust at launch and assume it will translate directly to more payload getting to the moon. As a hypothetical example, you could build a giant rocket with a first stage that produces a colossal amount of thrust, but only a very small fuel tank, and a second stage that is basically a giant fuel tank but with a very weak engine. On paper, the maximum thrust figure would suggest it should get a huge payload to the moon. But in reality, whilst it would launch okay, once the first stage was depleted and dropped, it wouldn't then have enough power to continue lifting itself, and instead it would slow down and fall back to Earth. So you can't just take the headline figure to draw a conclusion from. You have to break it down into its various stages to get a better understanding, which is the same approach that today's sponsor, Brilliant.org, takes. They make online learning effective by breaking their courses down into more bite-sized classes, along with using interactive animations that you can engage with to help make the topics more visual, which I personally find makes it much easier to understand. And there is no shortage of topics to choose from. Whether you are a science sleuth, a maths monster, or a coding connoisseur, there is something for everybody. You can do just a few minutes a day to help keep your brain in tip-top condition, even whilst travelling thanks to its app. Now, regular viewers of my channel know I am a long-time user of Brilliant, with my daily streak of completing lessons now surpassing 1,000 consecutive days. But you don't just have to take my word for how good it is. Grab yourself a 30-day free trial by visiting my link brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan, and doing so will also earn you 20% off their annual premium subscription. So let's start to break down these figures, though please do bear in mind, This is literally rocket science, and it's very complicated, especially to try and lay out in a short, simplified video. So I'll run through some rough numbers to try and help highlight why the Saturn V's payload figures are better than SLS, but these won't be exact, and they're not going to include a lot of variables like changing engine thrust when you're operating at sea level versus in a vacuum. Now, the Saturn V consisted of 3 stages to get to orbit. The S1C was used to get off the pad. When that was jettisoned, the S2 took over and would get them to almost orbital velocity. Then finally, the S4B did a short burn to achieve orbit, and that was later relit to head to the moon. A total mass on the pad of about 2.9 million kilograms. As mentioned already, at launch it produced 34.5 million newtons of thrust, which came from the 5 monstrous F1 engines. These burnt for 150 seconds, going through some 2 million kilograms of fuel before the stage was jettisoned. In fact, of the 2.9 million kilograms of the Saturn V, 2.2 million kilograms was the first stage alone. After the first stage was jettisoned, the remaining parts of the Saturn V had a combined mass of just over 750,000 kilograms. This had an altitude of 100 kilometers, was about 280 kilometers downrange of the pad, and was traveling almost 10,000 of the 28,000 kilometers an hour required for orbit. The stack was then propelled for the next 6.5 minutes by the 5 J2 engines of the second stage that produced around 4.4 million newtons of thrust. This carried the crew to 160 kilometers in altitude and to a velocity of 25,000 kilometers per hour when it was then discarded, with the final push coming from a single J2 engine of the S4B, producing 1 million newtons of thrust for 165 seconds to get 140,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. The S4B was then later relit for 312 seconds to propel the CSM and lunar module towards the moon. By comparison, the SLS on the pad has a mass of 2.6 million kilograms and produces 39 million newtons of thrust at launch. However, its initial thrust comes from a combination of 4 RS-25 engines in the main core stage, plus 2 solid rocket boosters. And the SRBs are actually responsible for about 30 million newtons of the 39 million launch thrust. These burn for 126 seconds before being discarded, and weigh 725,000 kilograms each. However, unlike the first stage of the Saturn V, which produced a fairly consistent thrust during the ascent, solid rocket boosters produce peak thrust when they're first lit, and the thrust level gradually decreases as the surface area of the fuel changes. So, whilst SLS begins with more power than the Saturn V, throughout that initial ascent, the thrust level is actually constantly decreasing. After SRB separation, the main core stage continued on, burning for a further 374 seconds, whilst producing 9 million newtons of thrust. Now, the core stage at launch has a dry mass of 98,000 kilograms and is carrying just under 1 million kilograms of propellant. That propellant is gradually burnt over a period of 500 seconds, so it's going through about 1,975 kilograms per second. So after 126 seconds, when the SRBs are jettisoned, the core stage has also burnt through around 250,000 kilograms of propellant, which leaves around 900,000 kilograms of rocket being propelled by the 9 million newtons of thrust. This carries on for a further 374 seconds before it too is discarded. At this point, SLS isn't actually in a complete orbit. It's in a high transatmospheric trajectory, and when it reaches apogee, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or the ICPS, then firstly performs a burn to raise the perigee so it doesn't fall back to Earth, and then later performs the translunar injection burn to send the payload to the moon. However, whilst this stage engine can burn for 1,125 seconds, it only produces 110,000 newtons of thrust. So roughly, for sending payloads to the moon, the Saturn V produces 34.5 million newtons of thrust for 150 seconds, 4.4 million newtons for 390 seconds, and 1 million newtons for 477 seconds. Whilst SLS produces 39.1 million newtons for 126 seconds, 9 million newtons for 374 seconds, and then 110,000 newtons for 1,125 seconds. Where the big differences seem to lie is, Firstly, the main source of thrust for SLS is the SRBs, which are constantly losing power over time. Much of the extra mass of the Saturn V was fuel that allowed the first two stages to burn for a total of 40 seconds longer than the core stage of SLS, and with the third stages, the ICPS of SLS is very underpowered compared to the S4B of the Saturn V. Yes, it can burn for longer, but it's severely lacking in thrust, which heavily restricts how much mass it can propel to the moon. If you enlarge the payload of Artemis, then the ICPS stage won't be able to get it up to enough speed in order to then reach the moon. Now, like I said, those are just rough figures and they don't factor in a lot of aspects such as engine efficiency that often varies whether you're operating the engine at sea level or in the vacuum of space, and that the two rockets are on different orbits. The Saturn V launched into a fairly circular, low orbit around Earth, whereas Artemis's core stage launches it into a high elliptical path. In fact, the difference in orbits continues because Apollo flew a very direct route to the moon, which took about 3 days, because they were somewhat restricted by crew supplies and such. Artemis I, by comparison, was able to take a more efficient gravity-assisted route that took 5 days. So it's more efficient but slower than Apollo. And really, that seems to epitomise the difference between the Saturn V and SLS. The Saturn V did not have the time to be efficient, either in flight or the overall Apollo program, whereas the Artemis program seems less concerned about the speed that they get to the moon and instead is focused on efficiency. When the Saturn V was created, NASA basically had no restrictions. It was a case of get the job done, whatever the cost. And the rocket was designed from the ground up entirely with that purpose in mind. SLS, by comparison, is bogged down with bureaucracy and budgets. Governments wanting to put people back on the moon, but not wanting to spend huge sums of money to do it. Hence, the current SLS is basically a mishmash of existing hardware. The external fuel tanks and the SRBs are just lengthened versions of those that were used on the space shuttle. The RS-25 engines of the SLS core stage are literally off the space shuttle. NASA had 16 of them left over from the shuttle program, so have thrown them onto SLS. But these are RS-25D versions from the shuttle, which were designed with reusability in mind, but SLS expends them after each launch. Eventually, they will be upgraded to RS-25E versions for Artemis V that are designed to be expendable, so will have a simplified design as well as providing about 160,000 newtons more thrust to the core stage. The ICPS stage is actually from a Delta IV, which, as already covered, is far less powerful than the S4B stage of the Saturn V. Originally, it was considered that SLS would use the Earth Departure System, which was a stage being developed for the cancelled Ares 5. That was going to be an improved version of the S4B using a new, more powerful J2X engine. But this was then later scrapped in favour of a brand new Exploration Upper Stage. However, this stage is still in development and won't be ready until Artemis IV in potentially 2 years' time. This is basically why the Saturn V is currently better than SLS. The current Artemis flights are using an SLS Block 1. The Saturn V could get 61% more payload to the moon than a Block 1 SLS. But that figure is set to increase to 42,000 kilograms, almost matching the Saturn V with the Block 1B improvements like the RS-25E engines and the more powerful Exploration Upper Stage. Further improvements for a Block 2 SLS, such as improved boosters, should see the SLS surpass the lift capabilities of the Saturn V, but those improvements are a few years away, if at all, given all the current government bureaucracy going on. It somewhat feels like NASA is going with the worst of both worlds at the minute. Back with Apollo, they were not only against the clock, but they were developing an entirely new family of rocket for the job, so it was very expensive and complicated. But they just put all their time and resources towards that project. Now they want to go back to the moon, but they want it done cheaper, so are using an arguably worse design by basing it on existing hardware which was not actually designed with SLS in mind. Now that, in theory, should make the program quicker because they're using a lot of already proven tech, but they seem to have no urgency. Hence, it's been 4 years since Artemis I, and we're only just readying for Artemis II. Whilst in the same time frame, the Saturn V went from its first test flight in 1967 to 4 years later in 1971, they'd launched 10 Saturn Vs and flown humans to the moon 6 times. I mean, even look at SpaceX. It's been less than 4 years since the first test flight of a full Starship stack, and we're now gearing up for its 12th flight on the third version of hardware that is trying to do something far more complex by making it completely reusable. Though in reality, SLS isn't actually going to be that cheap long term because it's got the same problem that the Saturn V had. Every Saturn V was completely expended, so each new launch required an entirely new rocket to be built. That's part of the reason why Saturn was scrapped in favour of the Space Shuttle, because the Space Shuttle was trying to promote reusability. Now you have the likes of SpaceX and Blue Origin that are putting in large sums of money up front in order to develop a reusable system that will be cheaper long term. NASA can't do that because they've not been given the budget short term to develop such a system, but then it means they're stuck with a system that long term is going to be costing more money per launch. Imagine what could have been done if the reins were let off. If NASA were given the funding and the freedom to build a new human moon rocket from scratch and with some urgency. Unfortunately, that seems to have been lacking until recently, with rumblings now beginning that China is aiming to put humans on the moon by 2030. Suddenly now they're picking up the pace. Just as was the case back in the 1960s with the Soviets. But anyway, that's going to be it for this video. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments between SLS versus the Saturn V. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.